This tutorial is going to be all about layer masks. Layer masks, slightly different than clipping masks, and offer different functionality and sort of different effects. So, a very simple layer mask. This is, just a photo of this guy that's always hanging out in like Times Square in New York. Um, Interesting photo, very very colorful, lot going on. There's a lot to look at here, though. Um, what if we want to force people, the viewer, to look at a very specific area of the image, like the guy down here, by doing something like this? So here, first thing you notice, black and white back here, grayscale, and kind of blurry. Where we're trying to focus the viewer's attention is saturated with color and crisp and clear. We do not want to look at things that are blurry if we have the choice. If an image has color versus grayscale, we're going to want to look at the color. Again, naturally, our eyes kind of are drawn to that. So basically, we can use what's called a layer mask to achieve that. And we're just going to open the layer mask image in Photoshop. The first thing we're going to do is just make a copy of the background. Several different ways we could do this. We could select all and copy and paste. We could also just right click and duplicate our layer. And I could just name it whatever we want. I'm just going to leave it named background copy for a second. But we're basically going to have one layer that is normal, and we're going to have one layer that is desaturated and blurred. And then we're going to do our mask from there. So just like the clipping mask, we need two layers to make this work. I'm going to call this top layer desaturate. And blur. I'm going to leave the background the way it is. But now we need to desaturate and blur it. So we've done desaturate before, or at least in some of the tutorials it's been covered. We can go to image and adjustments and desaturate. If we want to completely remove all color, that's what we do. If you want to control the level of desaturation, you need to go to hue and saturation, and then you'll get a slider. Otherwise, desaturate just does that. Now we're going to blur it, and we want to basically mimic the effect of a lens blur. We want to mimic the effect that we actually are doing this in camera, like we're focusing on the guy but not on everything else, which you can do if you have let's say a DSLR camera with a fairly decent lens on there. You basically can change the f-stop and a couple of the other parameters on there, and kind of have things really in focus, and then maybe the background and the foreground out of focus. We can fake it in Photoshop, though. We're going to look at the filters now, and we've in the other one of the other tutorials, we go to the filter gallery, which basically shows all the artistic filters, like all the kind of different brush filters and posterize and all that. But there's a bunch of other things that we can do here as well. And just before we even do what we need to do, some of these things are kind of interesting. So in like distort, you can just mess around with these. Again, you're not going to ruin anything. Like, what happens if you do some of these things? Just experiment. What happens if you pinch? Well, it's kind of showing you here what that's going to do. It's sort of pinching your image in, showing you like a little grid over here, and you can do things like that, almost like a fisheye. Some of the other filters, like pixelate, pretty straightforward. There's a bunch of different ways you can pixelate things. Noise. Why would you want to add noise? Well, noise will add like a little bit of graininess, especially if you just go to add noise. You can kind of dirty up your picture and make it look like an old photograph by adding a little noise, and it'll, again, look a little grainy. We can sharpen. We can do some other things. Really what we want to do now, though, is go to the blur menu, and we want to do a lens blur. And that's going to bring up this box here. And it's going to be kind of a default blur. But you can make it more blurry here by changing the radius. That's basically the thing here that matters the most with blurring, is how blurry do you want it to be? Now, I would say it's pretty hard to look at this when we're blurring it. That's the whole point, though. We want this to be fairly blurry because we're going to actually have a nice sort of gradient where it's going to be really blurry up here, and it's going to get more crisp as we get towards the figure. If you are a super, photography nerd, you can even get in here and change the shape of your iris, which is like, based on like different lenses and things out there. The blade curvature and rotation, most of this stuff doesn't really matter much. You can actually even add noise here if you want to add a little bit of graininess. It's kind of built right into this filter, but this is good for now. I'm just going to click OK. And yeah, this looks pretty horrible. It's hard to look at. It's blurry. It's like our eyes can't focus on it. But that's the whole point, and this is the whole reason that we're going to do this, is so that we can do what's called a layer mask. The layer mask is this little icon down at the bottom. It's just called Add a Layer Mask. It's basically a rectangle with a little circle inside of it. We need to have the top layer selected to do this, so make sure that this is the layer that's selected, and we're just going to click that little button. What the heck happened? Well, nothing, really. The only thing that really happened is that we now have this little thumbnail that popped up that represents the layer mask. Our image didn't change, though, at all. When you create a layer mask, basically what you can do is you can allow parts of the layer below it to show through the layer that's on top. White in this thumbnail means that it's blocking the layer below it. This entire thumbnail is white all the way. The whole layer is filled with white. Therefore, we cannot see through to the background. If I were to come over here, and you don't need to do this, but I'm just going to come over here to prove the point. I'm going to make black my foreground color, and I'm going to get the paint bucket. And if I have this thumbnail selected, when I click over here, it's only going to drop the paint into the thumbnail. It's not going to make this layer actually black. It's just going to make the thumbnail black. And right away you see that not only is my thumbnail now black, but I can now see through all of the background can show through that top layer. So black allows the layer below it to show through. White obscures the layer below it to show through. What we want is basically to have a nice little gradient there. So again, I'm gonna fill this back in the way it was. And this time, instead of using the paint bucket, I'm going to use the gradient tool. The gradient tool basically allows you to click and drag a gradient in sort of whichever direction that you want. And before you even sort of, right away, I guess you can see what's happening here. I'm dragging from the starting point, wherever I drag, and you get this kind of like rubber band, I guess, that you can drag in whichever direction that you want. Whatever direction you drag the tool, that's going to be the direction of the gradient, which you can kind of see down here in the thumbnail. And the longer you drag it, the more subtle the gradient is going to be. The shorter you drag it, the more abrupt the gradient is going to be. So right now we're starting to get closer to the example I showed. However, By default, the gradient is a linear gradient. It is like left to right, up to down, whichever direction I drag it. Notice I'm not undoing. Every time you change the gradient, you can just keep doing it until you like it. It's not cumulative. It's not adding it to the gradient you previously dragged. You can just keep doing it until you like it. This is great, but in the example, I used what was called a radial gradient. So it's the next one over. Up at the top here, basically you have, my gradient is black to white. That's just because my foreground and background colors are black to white. If I change it back to black being my foreground color and white being my background, it changes the the relationship of my gradient, and therefore the relationship of kind of which color gets put first. So it's going to be black at the beginning of my line, and it's going to be white at the end of my line, because that's what's going on right here. You can basically click on this gradient and choose it. Or there's a bunch of other different kind of gradients you can choose here, like basic gradients. Like here's black to white, or foreground to background. Here's just plain old black to white. And you can basically change your gradient there. You can also reverse your gradient right here just by clicking that little button. But either way, we want to actually have the radial gradient selected. And so the radial gradient is going to allow you to drag kind of a spotlight. If you look down on my little thumbnail here. So it's going to be black in the center, and it's going to be gray, start to turn to midtones and grays, and then to white around the outer edge. And now my thumbnail down here has a little kind of a spotlight, a reverse spotlight, I guess, because it's black. But now the gradient is basically, it's focusing directly on the guy and not the kind of linear gradient that we had before. If you're doing it and you're getting the opposite result, like this, like you're doing it and the guy is getting blurred out instead of the background, just reverse your gradient and the opposite should happen. With the radial gradient, it doesn't matter which direction you drag your little rubber band. Because it's radial, it's going to radiate from the center, from where you started to where you left off. It's really just how far do you drag it. Again, the shorter it is, the more abrupt the gradient. The longer you drag it, the more gradual the gradient will be. So again, very, very quick and easy. It takes a little bit of practice to get used to it, but you can get a pretty interesting result very quickly. And this again is using the same image, right? We don't have two different images going on. We just have two different layers. One image, one layer is the same image as the background. It's just been desaturated and blurred. There's another kind of slightly more creative, I would guess you could say, way to use this, to create something like this. So here we're using and actually a linear gradient this time, and we're using the layer masks to kind of have this skull show up in the woman's face. So let me show you that. I'm just going to get rid of this. We're going to open the skull and the woman here now, images in Photoshop. The first thing I did was I went into image adjustments and hue and saturation. I desaturated it a little bit. I maybe made it a little creepier. Just kind of made it a little yellow. I don't know. I liked the way that looked. And we need to get this skull over onto the background too. Again, it doesn't merely matter what order we're doing this. I'm going to go to the object selection, and I'm going to select my subject. Let's see if it works. Since it's a skull floating on a white background, it should work pretty well. Let me look at select and mask. And I'm going to shift the edge in a little bit and feather it. And put it on the back on the white background. I'm going to go ahead and copy that. And again, that's just going to kind of soften the edge. Do we really need to do the select and mask for this? I don't know. We're not trying to integrate this thing into a collage where it might look like a sticker if we don't. But why not get used to doing that all the time? So basically, I'm going to rename this new layer. I just copied and pasted it here. I'm just going to name this skull. Turn that off for a second. What we're going to need is basically, we're going to leave our background the way it is. We need her hands and the hair on the left side of the image to be in its own layer. Otherwise, this skull is going to float in front of everything, which is not going to look right. So I'm going to use the quick select tool. Fairly large brush, not gigantic, but I'm just going to kind of get in here and select the fingers. If your quick select tool is acting all wonky and it's not selecting what you think you're trying to select, it could be because you have the skull layer selected. So always pay attention to which layer is selected to make sure you're actually working on the layer you think you're working on. It over-selected some of this, so I'm going to zoom in a little bit here. I'm going to lower my brush size, and I'm going to hold Option to deselect these areas. I want to select, make sure I have everything I want selected. That doesn't look too bad. Select and mask. That looks okay. And now I'm just going to copy and paste that. So now that new layer, which is I'm just going to call hands and hair, it'll look like this. The skull is still floating on top because it is on top of my layers palette. I just need to move the skull below, and now I have something like this, which looks kind of weird. So let me move the skull up here. And I'm going to reduce the opacity of the skull because I need to kind of get it in the right place, for one thing. And I think it's just going to look good that way. Right now, it looks pretty creepy. I mean, do we call it a day? I don't know. It's creepy, but I don't know. I think this is slightly creepier. There's something about it. So once again, we're going to create a layer mask. The skull layer is selected. We want to mask it to the background so that the background was going to show through a little bit. So I'm going to create that clipping mask. I'm going to come back over to my gradient tool. This time I do want it to be linear, because otherwise this is going to happen. Yeah, I don't know. Kind of interesting. Not quite exactly what I want. The linear gradient's going to be much better. And I can just kind of keep doing this until I really like it. Like, which way do you want it to look? That's pretty freaky. Here's the opposite. It's pretty freaky too. And then, you know, basically, you can leave it as is. Or you could change the opacity of the skull layer as well. You can make it higher or lower. You kind of mess around with the gradient, and then you could come back to the gradient and do it even more. You can just keep doing this until you like it. Yeah, I kind of like that. That's slightly creepy, even though it's slightly different than what we started with. But again, could you do this other ways? Heck yeah. Could you do this though and just keep clicking around until you like the result? Heck No, not a possibility. So again, with masking, it just makes it so much easier once you get it all set up to, you know, to produce a pretty interesting effect. So that's it for masking. So once again, in this whole tutorial, we looked at all the ways that you can, several different ways you can use a clipping mask, and which is a little different. I'm sorry, you can use a layer mask, which is different than the clipping mask in the other example. The clipping mask is great if you want one image on one layer to show through the shape of another layer kind of all at once, or maybe you want to reduce the opacity a little. That's great. Layer masking lets you do more advanced things like this, where you can use gradients and other effects to get the results that you're looking for.